Yeah, so my real job of being here is to introduce my good friend, Josh McKoon. And you know I hear in politics all the time, everyone stands up and says, my good friend, my good friend, my good friend. And they're not their good friend. and that annoys me as somebody around politics more than I want to be, actually. So you should never like people that really like politics. That's actually my opinion. But anyway, so Josh McKoon is one of those people. But he's a warrior for us, and he is my good friend. And I was saying earlier, he's like a brother to me. We come from the same place in this state. We grew up in the same location, and he is good people, that man right there. And he is who you want on your side when you need somebody to deliver an argument and make it persuasive and articulate. Josh McKoon is the person to call on. And he made a wonderful case down at the Capitol for why we really need to be focused on the Secretary of State's race and why it's going to be hotly contested by the Democrats. He's in a primary right now. He needs us to help him get through the primary. I support Josh. Josh could, I'll be honest, Josh could run for anything and I would support Josh. But Josh knows well the stakes that are at play here with the Secretary of State's race, and I'll let him speak to that. He did a great job articulating why he is the best Republican candidate and why we need to support him in this primary, and why he is the only person who's really going to be situated to take the message statewide and beat the Democrat in this race. It will be a well-funded Democrat, and so we need somebody as knowledgeable as Josh McKoon to do this. And Josh, I know has people around the state know him. People have an affinity for him. People respect him around the state. When I ran for a state office a few years back, I went to every place. It's a big old state, as Eric Johnson once told me. It's a big old state when you drive around it. And Josh wasn't running statewide, but he would often be there. He would often be everywhere I was. And he was, no one, I don't think anyone has a greater reputation around the state for being such a defender of conservative values and an articulate messenger for the Republican voice. And so he has that grassroots support already built because he's been there in every town in Georgia from top to bottom, and they know him and they trust him, and so I think that he's got an advantage there, and we need to continue to help him have that advantage and be able to exploit that advantage and bring that to DeKalb County so that the DeKalb County GOP and all of us voters out here are supporting Josh McKoon. There is no finer man. There is no more. There's nobody who has more integrity than Josh McKoon in state politics today, in my opinion. So with that, I will say to you, I am introducing, and I earnestly believe, my very, very good friend, Josh McKoon.
Thank you. Well, if everybody's persuaded to vote for me, I can just sit down and we can go home now, right? Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate that. I'm so grateful for your service. When you find somebody who is really committed to principles and willing to stand up for them, even when sometimes it's uncomfortable to do that, you really got to grab hold of that person and do everything you can to get them elected. So I appreciate everything that you do. I do want to say, basically to the three gentlemen at this table, Jim probably, other than people that are directly working for this campaign, has probably heard the speech I'm about to give to you more than anybody else. And he came here anyway, so I appreciate that. Dave Baker, some of the issues I've been involved with at the Capitol, it can be kind of lonely to be pushing those issues. They're real popular out here, but they're not very popular down there. And there's this small, dedicated, incredibly talented band of lobbyists and advocates who faithfully come down over and over again to help us on those issues. And Dave and I were talking about something he was doing just on Thursday, and I'm so grateful for what you do for the conservative movement every day.
Thank you.
And finally, I'm very grateful that y'all did not let Melvin Everson speak before I got up to speak. When I was running for state senate the first time, I don't know if you remember this or not, but we were in LaGrange, Georgia together. It was Labor Day weekend. We were at Lafayette Square in downtown LaGrange. And I was so excited because it was one of the first big speeches I was giving in front of a big crowd. And so they give me the list, of who's speaking, and it's Melvin Everson and then Josh McKoon. And he gets up there and he gives this incredible stem winder of a speech. And I'm just like, how am I going to follow that? So, but I'm so grateful for your friendship. I'm grateful to see you today. What I love about campaigning statewide, Nancy mentioned you get to see all these different communities, but it's exciting to get up on a Saturday morning and be with people who care so much about their community and their state and their country that they want to come together and figure out a way to make it better. So thank y'all for being here today. What I'd like to do with my time is to tell you a little bit about who I am and where I come from for those of you who have not met me before. I'd like to tell you why I'm running for Secretary of State, what I hope to accomplish in the office, and finally I want to talk about why I think I'm your best choice in the May 22nd Republican primary, because at the end of the day, there are 4 people running for this job, and you've got to make a decision about who you think is the best choice to be the Republican nominee. My family moved to Columbus, Georgia, because my great-grandfather had a job opportunity to come work at the Eagle and Phoenix textile mill in downtown Columbus, right along the Chattahoochee River. He worked in that mill for 50 years. My grandfather dropped out of school in the 8th grade in the middle of the Great Depression to help take care of our family. He worked a lot of odd jobs until World War II broke out. And then he went down the street not far from Columbus to Fort Benning. He enlisted in the Army. He served in the Pacific during the war. When the war ended, he moved back to Columbus. He married my grandmother, who worked at commercial printers in Columbus. And then he had a couple other jobs when he came home. He was a milkman for Wells Dairy in Columbus. He was a conductor for the Central Georgia Railroad for a while. Eventually, they saved up enough money to open a little grocery store at 5th Avenue and 8th Street in downtown Columbus. And that was the first of several small businesses they would own and operate. They had a gas station, they had another grocery store. One of my earliest childhood memories is of refilling the Coca-Cola machine with my granddad at the laundromat that they owned and operated, which was the last of those small businesses before they retired. My dad was the first member of our family to go to college. He went to Auburn University. He worked at the same Eagle and Phoenix mill in the summertime to pay tuition. And he went on to law school. He's been practicing law now for the last 40 years. I followed in my dad's footsteps. I went to Furman University for my undergraduate degree. And they tell you in these kind of talks to get the bad news out of the way up front. So I'm going to go ahead and tell y'all, I went to the University of Alabama for law school. That's been a little bit of a sticking point in this campaign. As a matter of fact, the likely Democratic nominee in this race, a fellow named John Barrow, who you may or may not know, was a congressman from the Augusta, Athens area. He got on Twitter. I guess everybody knows what Twitter is because of the president. He got on Twitter and on the night of the national championship game and said, I hope everyone running for Secretary of State is pulling for Georgia, including Josh McKoon, who went to the University of Alabama. Well, of course, I've been a Georgia fan my whole life, much to my dad's chagrin. So I responded to him on Twitter and I said, look, I'm pulling for Georgia tonight, and I didn't even have to ask Nancy Pelosi permission. And since then, I have not heard from the congressman on Twitter. But I tell y'all all that just to give you a sense of who I am and where I come from. And what's really animated my interest in politics and public affairs is that, this state and this country have allowed my family, generations of my family, to live out our American dream. We've been able to go after what we wanted and achieve it because of the freedom that we have in this country to pursue our dreams. But for the average person, I think it is getting harder, not easier, for them to achieve their American dream. And I think the primary obstacle is a government that has gotten too big and gotten in the way of the individual pursuing their American dream. So, why run for Secretary of State? I'd been in the Senate for the last 6 years, and And in 2017, I made a decision not to seek re-election. And that was not in anticipation of running for another office. I actually thought I'd take a break from elected politics. I had a couple of pretty significant life changes. In July of 2015, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks to the day of that diagnosis, she passed away. And that focuses your mind in a lot of ways about your own mortality and making the time you have on this earth count. In August of 2016, I made one of the best decisions of my lifetime. I married Jacqueline Bird, and that was a big, big life change. So I had made the decision I would maybe take a break from elected politics, focus on my law practice, and then Secretary Kemp decided to get in the governor's race. And I started having people approach me and say, we need a lawyer in this job. We need somebody who understands election law. We need somebody with legislative experience. You ought to think about running. And so Jacqueline and I spent a couple of months praying over that decision and got in the race, and we've been in the race now for about 8 months. So what is this campaign about? Why am I running for Secretary of State? I'm running to make Georgia the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. That's really what this campaign boils down to. Now, I want to take a moment or two to expand on what I mean by that. Most people know the Secretary of State is involved with elections administration. Some people know that the Secretary of State's office handles corporate filings and corporate paperwork, does some securities and charities regulation. A lot of people aren't aware of the fact that the Secretary of State administers 41 licensing boards that issue over 100 licenses. Now, when you think about it, all a license is a permission slip from government that you pay for to go do a job, right? Now, 40 years ago, fewer than 1 in 20 Americans had to have a license to go to work. Today, it's more than 1 in 4. And I think the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of overregulation. For example, there are good reasons to have licensed professions, public health reasons, public safety reasons. That's why we license nurses, because we want to make sure you are safe when you're receiving health care. It's why we license engineers, because we don't want this building to collapse on us. Those are good reasons to license those professions. I think if we stopped requiring a state license for librarians tomorrow, there would not be a public health or public safety crisis. Wouldn't you agree? So there's some opportunities to deregulate, but then there are other opportunities to simply ask the first question, is this something that should require a permission slip from government to go do? And then the second question is, if it does require that permission slip, how do we speed up the connection of people to the dignity of honest hard work? A cosmetology license holder in our state, this is a license to cut and color hair and do nails. On average, they spend 350 days in training before they get their license. Thousands of hours of training. Now, by comparison, an EMT license holder, this is a license to render life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency. That person, on average, receives 31 days of training. Now, it is hard for me to understand why it would take 10 times the training to get a license to cut and color hair and do nails as it would be to render life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency. We need to look for ways to streamline that process, because for a lot of people, that disqualifies them on day one. They can't spend a year paying tuition, not getting a paycheck. So whether it's apprenticeships, whether it's leveraging some of our relationships with college and career academies, we've got to find a way, working with the licensing boards, to connect people to the dignity of honest hard work faster. I spoke to a young woman a couple of months ago. She wants to cut and color hair. That's what she wants to do. She doesn't have an interest in nail care, and she was telling me, Josh, this is a pass-fail examination. I've got to prepare for the whole thing or not at all. Why would we do that? Why would we not make it modular so that she just takes the test for the skill she wants to go out and do? I mean, all of these things to me are pretty basic things that conservatives can get behind, and we don't have to play favorites with our tax code. We don't have to write some massive economic incentive check. We can just get government out of the way and create opportunities for people to work. Americans for Prosperity has done a nationwide study finding that over 2.5 million jobs would be created nationwide if we would simply reform professional licensing. Now, the flip side to this is that we've got to do a better job of providing services to professional license holders. We have over 170,000 licensed nurses in our state. Out of those, there are currently 550 open complaints pending with the Board of Nursing, where somebody has alleged that a nurse has hurt them or has in some other way failed to meet the standard of care. On average, it is taking 400 days to investigate those complaints before they even go before a tribunal to be heard. That is wrong. If the nurse didn't do anything wrong, that nurse needs their name cleared so that they can get back to work. If the nurse is hurting patients, they're still licensed. They could go get employment somewhere else. So we don't want a bad actor out there for over a year. So why is that? Why are we having that problem? It's not necessarily because of bad management. It's because the license fees that are paid are not going to the licensing board. They're going into a general fund to be divided by the legislature however the legislature sees fit. Secretary of State's office generates over $80 million in revenue through license fees and corporate fees that are paid, but receives about 60% of that money. So the question is, where's the other money going? We have 18 inspectors to handle these 41 licensing boards. That means we're asking a state employee on a Monday to walk into a funeral home, on a Tuesday to walk into a beauty parlor, on a Wednesday to walk into a chiropractic office, on a Thursday to walk into an optometrist's office, and be an expert in regulating all of those different fields. That is impossible. We need to have the resources, and we don't have to raise taxes to do this. We just have to constitutionally dedicate these funds so that the people who are paying for this service are getting what they pay for. I don't think should not be a controversial position for us to take. But the number one job of the Secretary of State, in my opinion, is to do this licensing reform, to make our licensing agencies work better so that we can connect more Georgians to the dignity of honest hard work. And that will make us the fastest state in the nation to get a job. Now let me spend a moment talking about elections, because everybody is concerned, rightly so, about elections. The first thing, and the thing I get asked about most often, what about the voting machines? Everybody's hearing that there's going to be something happening with the voting machines. We've had the same touchscreen voting machines now for about 16 years. They're coming to the end of their usable life cycle. Whether you love them or hate them, we are getting to the point where we're going to have to transition to a new voting solution. And we've got a range of options. We could do another fully electronic solution. We could do paper ballots that you just fill out and turn in. And then there's an in-between solution, and it's the solution that I personally like the most, which is a touchscreen machine that produces a physical ballot. Because what the touchscreen does is it eliminates problems with overvoting and undervoting. It makes sure the voter has fully completed their ballot. But then by printing out a physical ballot and turning it in, you get a paper backup that can be independently audited and verified. And to me, that's got to be at the base of whatever our new system is, because there's a crisis of public confidence in our elections. All this business about Russian hacking and everything. I mean, people are very concerned about the integrity of our election. Georgia is one of only 5 states in the nation that has fully electronic voting. The national trend has been to go away from that. And if you think about it, I'm sure most people in this room followed the mayoral race in the city of Atlanta. You had almost 100,000 people vote in the runoff in December. You had about a 750 vote margin between the winning candidate and the losing candidate. The losing candidate wants a recount. It's impossible to do a recount with our current technology. Now you can run that machine again to see if it gives you the same number that it gave you on election night, but there's no way to count the ballots because there are no ballots to count other than the absentee and provisional ballots. So by going to this hybrid technology, if we do have a really close race, we've got the physical ballots to do a manual recount to give people additional confidence in their election. It happened in Pennsylvania on Tuesday night in that special election they're still fighting over. All of those are electronic voting machines. So you can't really have a recount, the way Georgia law requires us to, by the way. The last thing I'll mention about voting machines, we need an open and transparent process. We are talking about spending perhaps over $100 million of your taxpayer money We need to make sure this isn't wired to get one vendor. We need to make sure everybody has the opportunity to compete, and we need to get the best value for your money. We need to make sure that there's a maintenance piece that's included with that, because we buy these machines and then they break down 2 or 3 years later. Commissioner Jester and DeKalb County property taxpayers shouldn't be paying for a mistake made by the vendor. We need to make sure that that maintenance and operations is built into the contract we sign. So that's my bit on voting technology. The other big challenge we have here is with legal challenges that occur. And this is why having a lawyer with election law experience, someone who's handled ballot access cases, someone who's handled election contests, is so critically important in this race. Secretary of State used to be a very sleepy job, to be completely frank with you. And then we had an election in the year 2000, a presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. Does anybody remember the lawsuit in Florida, the recount, Katherine Harris, the hanging chads, the butterfly ballot? Since then, there has been an explosion of litigation in elections administration. Now, part of the reason for that is in a state like Georgia, we're not going to allow, the Republican majority is not going to allow at the State House the other side to weaken voter integrity that's built into our election code. So the Democrats have not given up. What they've said is, okay, we're going to change our tactics. We're going to go from the State House to the courthouse. And so they've filed lawsuits to weaken our election law. And it's happened as recently as last summer. I know everybody in this room is familiar with the Karen Handel-John Ossoff runoff election. Well, in that election, the Democrats sued and said, you can't have this 30-day blackout period when people can't register to vote and participate in the election. Under Georgia law, this is a good reminder for everybody, if you want to participate in the May 22nd Republican primary, or you know someone who does and they're not registered, they've got to register by April the 24th in order to participate. Now, why is that? It's because we need that time, local elections officials need that time to verify that people who register are who they say they are and that they're eligible to vote. I mean, this is not rocket science, right? But they file this lawsuit, and a single federal judge in Atlanta says, yeah, you know what, they need an extra 60 days. So between the April first round and the June runoff, there are people registering in the middle of the election in DeKalb County, in Cobb County, and in Fulton County. Now, can you imagine the nightmare that is for the people who are trying to administer the election to figure out who's eligible, who's truly living where they say they're living, and so on? The Democrats registered over 10,000 new voters during that 60-day period. That election was decided by roughly 9,000 votes. Now, a lot of those newly registered voters chose not to turn out. We know that from looking at the credit for voting report. But if you don't think this matters, that election could have hinged on that decision. Now, what did the state of Georgia do when we lost in court and had a single federal judge tell us that the law put it together by our elected representatives was not conversant, should not be allowed? We surrendered. We didn't take it up to the Court of Appeals. We didn't try to take it up to the U.S. Supreme Court. You need an election lawyer in this job because it's important to be able to say, no, Judge, you got that wrong. We're going to fight that. We're going to get a stay of that decision. We could have gotten a stay, and we would not have had 10,000 additional people on the rolls in the middle of that election. We would have gotten a stay while that was pending. So you got to have somebody that understands these issues, and understanding them as you implement policy. Back in 2013, I was trying to get Georgia to change the way we handle military and overseas voting, because we had a 3-week runoff window, and federal law clearly said if you didn't have some other mechanism, if you were relying on the U.S. mail for people to vote, you had to have 45 days. Well, we didn't do anything. We got sued, and now we have this election calendar where you have legislators qualifying in the middle of the legislative session. You've got the primary occurring the Tuesday before Memorial Day, when people are in the teeth of high school graduations and all these other things. The reason for that is that your elected representatives didn't make that decision. A single federal judge made that decision. And that's because we weren't planning policy thinking about how federal election law works with state election law. So you need somebody who understands how that works. Now let me mention one other thing, and that has to do with absentee ballots. If you vote on election day, you got to display a photo ID, government issued photo ID. You vote early for the 3 weeks that you have to vote early. You got to display a government-issued photo ID. But if you vote absentee, we essentially have placed you on the honor system. You know, if you got the right birthday on there and the address and so on, you send that application in, you're getting the ballot. People on the left say, there's no voter fraud. That's just something made up by people on the right to make it harder to vote. You know, it is the most ridiculous thing that is said. There's voter fraud occurring all the time. In fact, in my home county, Nancy's home county, Muskogee County, we had an issue 4 years ago where we had somebody show up at the elections office with 19 absentee ballots in an envelope. And they said, I'm here to cast these ballots. And the elections worker was going to take the ballots. As luck would have it, our Republican member of the Board of Elections happened to be there, a fellow named U.D. Roberts, and U.D. said, hey, wait a minute. What are you doing with 19 absentee ballots? And so they decided to separate those ballots out and investigate. Now this lady said, well, I work in a nursing home in Columbus. I'm doing this as a service to the residents. I was just carrying this down here, you know, to help them. So they start looking into it, and they find out that 15 of the 19 folks that had cast ballots were so unwell, they were unable to sign their name or make their mark. But someone had filled out an application for an absentee ballot. Someone had voted the absentee ballot. And I bet this is going to come as a real surprise to you, but they did not vote for Republicans. They did not vote for Republicans. Now those ballots were discounted. No one was prosecuted. No one went to jail, okay? So the left would say, oh, well, the system works, right? Does anyone want to guess, other than Jim, does anyone want to guess how many sworn law enforcement officers work for the Secretary of State to handle complaints of voter or election fraud? Anyone want to take a guess? 4. Anybody else? 2. 2 is exactly correct. 159 counties. 2 people to handle any complaint of election fraud. Now this is a time-sensitive situation, right? This has to be investigated. If you've got a complaint on election day, you need somebody there on election day. So what if there's a complaint in Dunwoody, Thomasville, and Savannah? What are we going to do? We've got 2 people. We would not say, I don't think, that if we suddenly reduce the number of state troopers in the state to 2 to cover the entire state, I don't think we would say, well, we've solved speeding. There are no speeding problems anymore, right? We would say there's an enforcement problem, right? And that's what we have when it comes to voter fraud and voter integrity. So let me wind down. It's dangerous to give a lawyer a microphone in a captive audience. But what I want to finish my time with you is to talk about why I think I'm your best choice and what I'm asking for from you today. We've got 4 people who've qualified to be the Republican nominee for this position. I have nothing bad to say about any of the people running in this race. But you got to answer 3 questions in trying to decide who's the best person to be your nominee. The first question is, who's ready to do this job on day 1? In January of 2019, walk in the door and do the job. In my law practice, I've dealt with the corporations division. I've dealt with election law. In my legislative career, I've spent 6 years on regulated industries dealing with all the licensed professions. I've dealt with the securities and charities part of the office. I'm ready to walk in this office on January 1st and do the job. The second question you've got to answer is, who is the best choice to defeat John Barrow in November? John Barrow is a slick politician. He was in Congress for 10 years. John Barrow beat Republicans, well-funded Republicans, in districts that were voting for Republicans for president. This is not the average wacko, far-left Democrat. Although he's voted with them, he's going to portray himself as this sort of middle-of-the-road conservative Democrat. You need somebody on the debate stage with John Barrow who can not only communicate our message, but who can relentlessly prosecute the case against John Barrow and remind voters that he voted for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House, that he voted with Barack Obama 85% of the time as a member of Congress. This is not somebody who's in the middle. This is somebody who has voted for a very far left agenda. And frankly, the Democrats are so focused on this seat and are willing to spend millions of dollars to get it because they want to control the machinery of elections. Because to be very frank with you, they want to make it easier to cheat. We want to make it fair. Whatever happens, as long as the process is fair, I'm going to live with the result. But having same-day registration, allowing ballots to be printed in multiple foreign languages, having all these people down at the polls for assistance, these are all things that we've seen in other states that weaken the integrity of the process and make it easier for people to cheat. It's just that simple. So you've got to have your A player on the debate stage. This is not the time for somebody to learn how to run a statewide campaign or for someone to learn how to communicate these issues. You need somebody who's walking out on May 23rd ready to prosecute this case and run this general election campaign. I'm ready to do that. John Barrow's represented almost a third of Georgia during his 10 years in Congress. He's got some name ID. He's got a base already. You don't need to have somebody starting from zero. I have 21 state senators who are supporting me in this campaign, including Senator Fran Miller, who wanted to be here today. Some of you may know Fran has a very close family member who's very, very ill. He had to leave yesterday for that. That's why he's not here. He wanted me to mention that to you. But those 21 state senators collectively represent over 3.5 million Georgians. That's not to include the support I have from county and city officials around the state, like Commissioner Jester. We've got a statewide network already. So we're ready to prosecute this campaign. We're ready to defeat John Barrow in November. The third and final question is, anyone can get in front of this audience today and say, I'm the real conservative. I'm for voter integrity. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. It's real easy to make those kind of promises when you're running. When you get elected is when you find out how committed is someone to the promises they make. When I ran in 2010, I ran on a real simple promise. Georgia was one of 3 states that had no limitation on gifts from lobbyists to members of the General Assembly. You couldn't write a campaign check to a member of the General Assembly, but you could fly them to Europe, you could fly them to Jackson Hole, Wyoming during the session, and as long as you disclosed it, there was nothing illegal about it. And I had a choice to make. I learned very quickly that too was not popular under the Gold Dome, even with some of the members of my own party. And so I could have either gone home and said, look guys, this is too hard. I'm going to have to do some other things so that I can be effective. Or I could stay true to the promise that I made to the people that I wanted to serve. And I chose to honor that promise. And it took us 3 years, but we passed Georgia's first ever limitation on gifts from lobbyists to the members of the General Assembly. The best indication of future performance is prior conduct. You look at the 8 years I've served, you ask the people who are standing with me, they'll tell you, if I tell you I'm going to do something to the extent it is humanly possible for me to deliver on it, I'm going to do it. So what am I asking for from you today? If you've been convinced by what you've heard today that I'm your best choice in the May 22nd Republican primary, I'm asking for your vote on May 22nd for Secretary of State, or early if you choose to vote early starting April 30th. I'm asking for your personal endorsement. This is a race that people don't know what the Secretary of State does. People don't know who's running for Secretary of State. I have a gentleman in Columbus. He's been very supportive of me. He was introducing me around, this is back in October, and he said, we're going to get Josh elected Secretary of State, and after we get him elected, he's going to go around the world and negotiate trade deals for Georgia, okay? And up until a few days ago, I would say, no, that's Rex Tillerson. That job is taken. But I just tell you that to say people don't know. So the fact that I've had this opportunity to spend some time with you today, you can do a tremendous amount to help me win this election, not only by voting, but by going to your friends, your family, people you go to church with, people that you work with, and say, hey, I met Josh today. He's got the right ideas. We need to get behind him. Because what we don't need to have happen in this race is we don't need this going to a runoff. We don't need to be in late July with the nominee of the Republican Party being broke and having to totally refocus and restart their campaign with less than 90 days to the general election. So I really appreciate your time today. If there's time for questions, I'll be glad to answer them. If I've exhausted everybody, I'll sit down and thank you for your time very much.
Get a job, start businesses. The DBA license right now is the sort of entry point for someone who is starting a business, especially if you don't have the means of starting a C Corp or an LLC. would it make sense to, and currently you have to go through your county court to do that, and do you think there's an opportunity for the Secretary of State's office to centralize that and have that done sort of in an online application and sort of instant approval?
I would welcome that opportunity. Obviously, that would require working with some local authorities. I've learned in the legislature, sometimes you think, man, that's going to be a much more efficient way of doing things, and then counties and cities will say, oh, we don't know that we like that being taken away from us. But I think it's a good idea. It certainly goes in line with the philosophy that I've got. We want to do several things in the office to try to help facilitate people that are starting businesses. I had a gentleman I met just a month into this campaign just at a restaurant down the street from my law office, and he was telling me, you know, I work here 70 hours a week. I just got my real estate license. I've been studying for the test, nights, weekends, but I can't figure out how I can transition from where I am to doing real estate. And that guy really just needs some coaching, frankly. A lot of chambers of commerce already do this by providing these mentorship programs. What I'm interested in doing is providing a statewide database, or just a website that people could go to and say, you know, I live in Dunwoody and I'm looking to do this, and have a list of people they can connect with. And no, the Secretary of State's office isn't going to get into the business coaching business, but what it would do is provide a portal that people could go to and make that connection that private organizations are already trying to do, but put more of a spotlight on it. So I think all those kinds of things are things we can do in the office to try and get people to where they want to go and connect them with opportunities to go to work.
You want to take one or two more questions?
Sure.
Anybody else?
Yes. In view of the recent election, the media focus on trying to cause dissension and create doubt about elections, has the Georgia legislature really focused on the money side of replacing all these machines, and have they dedicated themselves to really doing what's necessary to give the Secretary of State the opportunity to have people who can follow up and enforce questions about voter fraud and replace these machines? The bad Kathy Cox, the Secretary of State, spent the millions for these machines. I believe they knew ahead of time that there would never be an audit trail, there would never be a way to check elections. It'd be manipulatable according to testimony before Congress. That's why they picked those machines. So our legislature, what can you tell us?
So right now we have a bill moving through the process, Senate Bill 403. And what that bill does is it puts out parameters for what our new elections technology should look like. It sets out a timeline for an RFP to be issued so that vendors can come in and compete for that business, and a timeline that gets us fully implemented by November of 2020, so that when we have the presidential election, when Donald Trump's on the ballot for re-election, that we will have moved to whatever our new solution is going to be. And so that part, I believe, is going to be passed this year. No funding has been appropriated by this year's legislature. I think what you'll see when we come back in January, when the legislature comes back in January, that there will be a move to appropriate that funding, whether it's a straight line appropriation or whether they use bond funding, because this is a 20-year purchase, basically. This is a once-in-a-generation investment in that technology. I'm confident the legislature is going to do that. When it comes to some of the other issues I talked about in terms of, for example, having more law enforcement to investigate complaints of voter fraud, I've spoken to most of the candidates for governor on the Republican side about this, and the candidates for lieutenant governor, to talk about that's going to be a decision that gets made in appropriations about whether or not we think that's important. I think we can make that case. Hopefully you were persuaded today that that's an investment we ought to make, and we're going to work on that after I get elected in our budget request going into fiscal year 20.
All right. Nothing.
2 questions, Senator. Thank you so much. My election to the Georgia House in 2005 was the first one under the new voter ID law here in Georgia. The Democrats attempted to roll that back, and I took to the well of the House and spoke out and not in favor of that, to maintain the voter ID, because I used the analogy, I said, if the NAACP requires you to have a voter ID to vote for their leadership, which they do, why not have a voter ID here in Georgia and across this nation? Because we only want citizens of this country participating in our political process. Second thing, do you see that surfacing again as far as them attempting to do away with the voter ID law? Because there's some scuttlebutt out there. It's disenfranchising voters. And second question, in regards to the two officers that were police investigators, I personally know when I was Georgia Commissioner of Equal Opportunity Governor, I personally know those two individuals came to me and said, we need help.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you sharing that, and I've definitely gotten similar feedback in talking to folks that they're not like the Maytag repairman, these two guys, right? I mean, they are being asked to investigate an awful lot of complaints that are being made. On your first point about photo ID, you bring up something that I normally talk about and failed to mention. There are two parts of that. Number one, if John Barrow is elected Secretary of State, I guarantee you they're going to default on a lawsuit to get rid of photo ID. So the Democrats have not given up on that. But there is another vulnerability to our existing photo ID system, and that is that the state of Georgia has issued 48,000 driver's license or identity cards to illegal aliens with deferred action. Now, why does that matter? Because when you apply for a driver's license, because of the federal motor voter law, unless you opt out, you are added to the voter roll. So we have a really significant vulnerability. I am working with a number of members in the Senate. We have a bill that we think we're going to be able to add some language to address this issue. I tried several years ago just to end the practice of issuing driver's licenses to illegal aliens, which I did not think was that controversial of a position to take. But we have come to a compromise, which is to say the driver's license that we do issue, we're not going to call it a driver's license. We're going to call it a driver's privilege card. And we're going to put some verbiage on there that makes it crystal clear to any elections worker that might be presented with it that the person they are dealing with is not a citizen. And I think that'll solve that problem. But they have not given up on it, is the answer to your question.
Okay, we have got time for one more question, and I honestly think that the gentleman in the back, did you have your hand up? No? Okay. Mary? Yeah, no? Didn't you?
Yeah, I have.
Okay, go ahead.
The Democrats know that there's voter fraud because Jimmy Carter, when he first ran in the white primary years ago, had to overcome a fraudulent situation. But I was a poll worker in DeKalb County, and I think the reason that our voter ID has been approved by the federal government or allowed is because it's toothless. Because every person that comes in there that doesn't have an ID card is allowed to vote provisionally. And who knows what happens to those provisional votes when they get back to the election headquarters. I think that they're probably just accepted without question.
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for being a poll worker, because we need more people that come to meetings like this to work the polls. That's a big part of making sure that we have a process that has some integrity to it. What I would say to you is you're absolutely right. If somebody shows up and they don't have a proof of identity, they say, I'm Josh McKoon, I'm on the list, but I don't have my photo ID, they're going to give me a provisional ballot. I do have to go back to the Board of Elections and prove my identity for that provisional ballot to be counted. And if people are witnessing practices where those are being counted without that proof being given, they need to be making a complaint on it, because they are required by law to prove their identity for that provisional ballot to be counted. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.